I just wanted to include a section on the law because sometimes people say, well, there's a lot of misunderstanding about the law, but also some people say, well, why don't we enforce the law? And I would say for a start, well, if it was that easy, we wouldn't have any problems now anyway, be it with dog control or access to the countryside or whatever it may be. And just in terms of public rights of way, one of the questions I would ask is, what conditions go along with the public right of way saying how you should be with your dog? What laws are they in terms of public rights of way to say how your dog should behave? Anybody know?
Open access.
Yeah.
Dogs on short lead.
Yeah. So there's no, but that's the thing, with public rights of way, there is no set legislation that says generally how dogs are to be on public rights of way. Some people say, oh, close control and all this sort of stuff, but there's a real jumble of legislation which isn't always that helpful. But generally on public rights of way, there is no general rule that says dogs must be on a lead or even under close control on rights of way, no more than there is for horse riders that says, oh, you should only canter at this point of view, or you should always walk or get off your horse or whatever. And the thing is, even on open access, there are these rules that came in when when it gave a right of access to mountain moor, heathland, downland, that sort of thing, that it was actually saying between March and July and in the vicinity of livestock, dogs should be on a short lead of no more than 2 meters. But actually, what's the offence if somebody doesn't do that? What can you do if they don't, March to July, they're walking over a bit of moorland or whatever and their dog's not on a lead, but they're using access land. What is the penalty for that in itself?
Is it law about you can shoot a dog if it's worrying livestock?
We'll touch on that in a second, but just the actual act of being on access land, but just not having your dog on a lead, even though that right of access says you must do from March to July.
It's a verbal warning, and that's all that takes place.
Well, not even that, because the only thing that happens is that technically they lose that right of access, so that you could ask them to leave as a trespasser and use reasonable force to do so. But when people say, oh, if you don't do that, you'll be fined and stuff, in essence, no. The legislation deals with stuff that says actually, yes, if your dog is worrying livestock, so attacking it, or even just what they call causing a loss in produce. So if a dog was chasing hens and that stopped it not to lay, that would be an offence too. But it's the specific acts that are a problem, that cause the offence, rather than just general things about leads and stuff anyway. So where we've got signs that actually say, unless there's been a special bylaw, and we'll chat about that in a session, that say dogs always on a lead and stuff, often that might be, people might feel that's really quite wise in that situation, but having the law to back that up isn't very helpful. And even close control, that is in the legislation, but this is livestock protection legislation. But that's saying actually your dog, while it's an offence for your dog to attack or chase or worry livestock, there's nothing that says in the law your dog always has to be on a lead around livestock. It's the act of actually worrying the livestock, not leads in itself. And even with sheep, okay, and people might not like this legislation, but I'm just telling you as it is, because I don't want, what we see is situations where farmers and other people think in their own mind that they can do this. And well, there's been cases in Devon and Cornwall where actually it's the farmer that's ended up in court because they've misapplied the law. And this is also backed up by the legal advice from National Farmers Union as well. So even with close control, the legislation there says that you're breaking the law if you're in an enclosure with sheep, so it doesn't apply to fell land or open moorland, that sort of thing. But if you're in a closure with sheep, and it's an offence if your dog isn't on the lead or otherwise under close control. Close control is a rubbish term. And one of the things, if any of you are doing signage or anything, please don't use it, because what does it mean? You just end up in an argument with people. Does that mean on a lead, a long lead, a short lead? In terms of like the advice that comes out from people like Kennel Club and Dogs Trust and stuff, the advice is around livestock, dogs on a lead. But actually in many cases that isn't backed up by law. And if they're not causing a problem, it's not an offence. So sometimes where you see people say, dogs not on a lead will be shot, not legally enforceable, and in fact if you did so it could be the farmer that ended up in court. If, just in terms of shooting dogs, if that's the only way to stop an offence that's happening, so the sheep are being chased or the cattle or whatever it is, and that's the only way to stop that happening. Yes, you can lawfully shoot the dogs and not be compensated for, killing somebody's property, but it is very much a last offence. That's how the law is, like it or not, but it's like a last resort. So it doesn't allow people, say, if it's happened, to then go back to somebody's house and shoot it. It's to stop the incident happening. There is legislation in other legislation, sections in other legislation that says it's an offence to, as you can see, recklessly disturb, damage or destroy protected wildlife features. So that could be a nest, or it could be young birds, or it could be adult birds or whatever. But it's the actual offence of doing that. And that's really hard to prove because actually the problem with dogs and wildlife generally is actually just a chronic issue of lots of dogs running about. Rarely you will see a dog coming back with a curlew in its mouth or something, but actually lots of dogs running about can stop the birds from nesting and this sort of thing. But actually being able to go to a magistrate and say, this particular dog on this day caused this, is very difficult. There was an issue in Cornwall on the Hale estuary where some swans were terribly killed. Well, they didn't die, but they had to be euthanized. So this Labrador had repeatedly gone into this water, and the swans had chased the swans and caught them, and all the skin had been taken off their neck. It was truly horrible. And Natural England, with the support of the council, took that to court because the area was designated for overwintering wildfowl, and this incident happened in December. So the guy got fined. Still, it wasn't a huge fine, maybe something about £600 or £700. And there was evidence that it was his dog, and so it was all good evidence trail. But the bizarre thing was, because of the law, if that had happened in the summer, he wouldn't have been able to be prosecuted because the swans were only protected in winter. Even though from an animal welfare perspective, that shouldn't happen anyway because it was horrendous. But the point I'm trying to make, and this isn't a day about law, and I can do that if you want, but the point is that actually you may think the law covers all these sort of things, but it actually becomes quite limited. When we've got our devils, if we go back to them, wherever they are, those are the people, let's have a look here. Our devils are like 5% or whatever, here we go. You need to be using the law with these people because they're not open to persuasion. But why I'm making these points that actually if we can make people have better decisions about like Fenton Zone or people wanting to go for a walk and be able to avoid the livestock areas or the cattle or whatever to get the experience they want, that's going to work with the many because I'm sure you're not going to have the resources to deal with all the people. But actually dealing with the devils who are not going to change their behaviour by any amount of persuasion or better information is the way forward. And again, I've got some advice sheets from National Farmers Union if people want to see this from their own bodies. But the law is comparatively weak. The one thing that you can do, those of you in the local authorities will be familiar with this, until fairly recently you could do dog control orders or bylaws before that. Now we have what are called public spaces protection orders, which aren't specifically about dogs. They're being used to deal with people rough sleeping or spitting or whatever it is, but it's basically saying if there's what's seen to be an antisocial behaviour that's causing a problem for local people, then you can use these to mean that if somebody isn't doing what you want, you can issue them with a fixed penalty notice up to about £100, or else if they don't pay that up, you can take them to court. And there's lots of guidance out from Welsh Government as well as DEFRA. And like the old dog control orders, you can impose dogs on leads areas, and that can be in town and country. Often they're used in parks, but you can do farmland if you want to, or no dogs areas, or you can limit the number of dogs one person has with them. So this is where you kind of get the power rather than the general legislation because it's designating specific areas. And a lot of these tend not to be that contentious, so like pick-up zones. A good one is dogs on leads by direction, so that means if somebody's seen to have an out-of-control dog, you can then make it for them an offence if their dog's off lead, rather than trying to upset all the dog owners. Unlike dog control orders, which parish and community councils used to be able to do, they can't do them. And the legal test for public spaces protection orders is this detrimental, I mean there's lots of them, but in essence this is the key bit, detrimental effect on the quality of life. And a key thing on that is people. So people have tried to use PSPOs for wildlife and actually had some difficulty. And you need evidence that it's persistent and unreasonable. So actually, just because of a one-off incident, you can't always use them for that. But what is really useful, let's just go back, are these bits which councils aren't using as much. You might be a very good go-ahead council in using these, but in the guidance, there's even more stuff about how do you deal with problem people. And they start off with antisocial acceptable behaviour contracts, community protection orders, and these are where you can target individual people to say this behaviour that you're doing is causing a persistent and significant effect on local people, and that could be playing loud music, it could be having a dog that's repeatedly straying from the home and going into areas where there's sheep, that you can do these very targeted measures. So rather than doing something on all dog owners and not being able to enforce it, you can actually target these things, which rack up to the point where actually eventually somebody could end up going to jail for non-compliance. And it can be all sorts of things. It can be about your dog wearing a muzzle or all these sort of things. So often people try and do that, let's have a restriction on everybody, when actually the issue is one or two people that are causing a problem. But there's some really good guidance out there from Welsh Government, and so if you are going to try and do legal measures, that's the way to go. But there's some questions to ask that, again, like there's no magic sign, there's also other stuff that you need to ask yourself, is that do you actually have evidence of a persistent, unreasonable and detrimental effect? This is for a public spaces protection order. Or is it just one or two people, in which case you use the legislation to target the problem people? What other problems have been considered? Will it solve the problem? So actually where a council is looking at doing, say, a restriction on a beach, will that solve the problem? Well, it might solve the problem for the people on the beach, but if that displaces everybody onto local farmland, it's just shifting the issue. So, for example, we've got the situation on the Wales Coast Path near here, heading more towards the border with England, where some places have done, well, they were all dog control orders, but now they're looking to do public spaces protection orders, where on the Wales Coast Path, they've done dogs on leads all year round restrictions, because they say, oh, that's needed for wildlife or whatever. So you've got maybe the coast here and the sea. But actually, when you're just doing that, and then there's farmland here. So actually, okay, so if you're actually on the right of way, you can be fine for having your dog off lead, but we know that people are actually looking for off lead access somewhere, and the whole of the coast path in some places, like Monmouthshire, and other places, are just, the whole coast path is dogs on leads all the way time of year. What's actually going to happen in terms of where people walk their dogs once that's been imposed? Where are they going to take off? Are they going to stop wanting to take off lead access? No. So where are they going to do it instead? Either on the farmland, or the bits off the path that are actually nearer the wildlife. As soon as you step off the path, the order isn't in effect. So this is one of the things that people think, oh yeah, that's great, let's do this order. But in reality, is it going to work? Or might it actually be better to have actually done something that said, actually, let's keep dogs off leads behind the screening bund that's there for flood defences, but actually help support the farmers and people at the other side. I don't know all the detail because I'm not working precisely with those councils. But what I'm saying is there's the issue of displacement, and whether it's you're thinking of having dogs on leads or no dogs in country parks or whatever it may be, there's going to be displacement most likely, and it's thinking about where that happens to. Otherwise, you end up getting farmers or other people just getting more dog owners looking for off-lead access on the land. Also, what's the least restrictive? Is it actually an issue of banning dogs, or is it dogs on leads, or is it targeting the problem people, as we're saying here? Can you enforce it? Who does the enforcement and fine collection? Because our devils probably are not going to pay the fines either. So what I want to make the point is actually that there is a place for legal action, but probably those of you that are involved with it, it's not always an easy option. And if we can deal with our fallen angels and a big group of people by giving them good information before they come, or giving them the options of where they can go and what they can do, that can be a really good way forward. The other thing as well, as we'll see later some councils doing, is actually when you're working with dog owners, they can become eyes and ears on the ground, they can report problems, they can say nice things about what you're doing to your elected members, where if the only dialogue you have is telling them what not to do and fining a few people, you're not actually making the best of those wider benefits. So actually, how do you work with the people that you can? and actually how do you target enforcement at people for whom that's the only option. And remembering as well that, yes, you can put up signs saying you can be fined for this or whatever, but actually the best way to influence where dog owners go and what they do is actually working with those communities, be it local dog trainers, be it the dog walkers themselves, so that people take cues off each other.